everyone. This is going to be the first lecture on the Civil Rights Movement, which is our last unit of the year. By Civil Rights Movement, of course, we mean the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States that took place mainly during the 1950s and 1960s. Before we get into the movement itself, though, we're going to be starting by looking at the status quo, essentially, in the United States when the movement began. So looking at what American society was like, what life was like for African Americans in this period leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. So, of course, from the very beginning of American history, race has played a central role in the way that American society and the American economy has functioned. Obviously, you have the long history of the enslavement of blacks in first the American colonies and then the United States through the first almost century of its existence as an independent nation. The American Civil War, of course, ended the institution of slavery. You had a period of about 10 years or so of Reconstruction after that conflict, where there was pretty significant progress made in terms not only of course, having ended slavery, but pushing for greater rights for African Americans, especially in the former Confederate states, the former slave states in the South. By the end of the Reconstruction period, though, which kind of officially comes to a close in 1877, you have the establishment of a new system, basically, of racial hierarchy that becomes known as the Jim Crow system. Reconstruction ends, and that includes the removal of federal troops from the South, the removal of a lot of the restrictions that had been in place on the southern states in the post-Civil War period, and again, in place of that is this new system known as Jim Crow. One of the defining features of that is racial separation, a system of segregation which attempts essentially to keep whites and blacks separated as much as possible. So this, of course, meant segregated schools, buses, theaters, hotels, hospitals, basically any sort of institution within society attempted to maintain this segregation as much as possible. And of course, it wasn't just separation, but it also was an unequal type of separation, where the facilities and services and conditions, basically, for blacks were almost universally worse than they were for whites. This was something enforced, not just through, state and local government practices, but just by the society as a whole. Now, again, this emerged during the post-Reconstruction period through policies being instituted by state and local governments, but it was challenged in the courts. You had most famously the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which ultimately made its way all the way to the Supreme Court in 1896. And in this case, basically, these segregation laws were being challenged on the basis that they violated the 14th Amendment. Now, that was one of the post-Civil War constitutional amendments. There were three of them. The 13th Amendment had outlawed slavery, The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law. Well, first, it basically established citizenship for anyone born in the United States, which included, of course, newly freed slaves, and then guaranteed equal protection under the law for all citizens. Um, the 15th Amendment then provided for basically voting rights for blacks, at least at the time, black men. This case, though, again, related to the 14th Amendment, the equal protection clause of that amendment specifically. But in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation laws were constitutional as long as the facilities were equal. And so, again, this became known as the separate but equal standard, essentially. As already mentioned, this was not a reality. That is to say, black schools, for example, didn't receive equal funding, equal resources. Other facilities that were for blacks were not, um, on the same level as those that were provided for whites. But nevertheless, this case at least established the principle that you could have segregation and it could still be considered constitutional. Um, so I just mentioned the 15th Amendment had provided for, again, it outlawed voting restrictions on the basis of race. But despite that, Southern states in, again, the post-Reconstruction period, all the way through the Civil Rights Movement, were still able to accomplish the effective disenfranchisement of African Americans despite the 15th Amendment. Now, they couldn't have a law that stated directly blacks can't vote. And so instead, they basically found other ways to accomplish this. One example was literacy tests. And so this would be basically a test that a potential voter would have to pass in order to register to vote. Now, immediately after slavery ended, after the Civil War, most newly freed slaves wouldn't have been able to read. And therefore, even an actual literacy test would have accomplished the goal of preventing many blacks from voting, or most blacks from voting. Similarly, another method, the poll tax, which required basically voters to have to pay a tax in order to register or to vote, that also would have effectively disenfranchised many blacks immediately after the Civil War. But of course, as years passed and decades passed, although you still had massive gaps in terms of income and wealth on the basis of race, you did see the emergence of a black middle class, and certainly many blacks, of course, did learn to read. But one thing that's important to keep in mind about these literacy tests is that typically they weren't really about reading anyway. It might be a test with random, sort of obscure questions, factual questions that someone would have to answer, that was designed basically to be failed by almost anyone who took it. And of course, even if you somehow passed it, it could be graded in a less than fair manner. And so it again was something that was put in place with the focus on the end goal of disenfranchising African Americans as opposed to the process itself. Now, again, looking at even the stated idea of a literacy test or a poll tax, which would make it so that only people with more education or more wealth would be able to vote. Well, besides blacks, there of course were many less educated and poor whites in the South who, in this system, were not meant to be prevented from voting by those who set up this system. So this is where grandfather clauses came in. And basically, this would be a provision in the law that said if your grandfather had been eligible to vote, then you would be exempted from these other requirements. And so, again, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, this would have meant that essentially all whites would be covered by this grandfather clause, and all blacks would have been um, not covered by it, since newly freed slaves, their grandparents would not have been eligible to vote. So this was sort of the legal system system of laws and policies that were put in place to achieve disenfranchisement to a very large extent. You also, though, had an informal system of doing this. Uh, Obviously, intimidation or outright violence could also be used against blacks who even attempted to try to register to vote or to vote. Um, or also just making it extremely um, inconvenient. Registrars' offices maybe being only open 1 day a month for a few hours. And so, again, making it as difficult or inconvenient as possible. So, I mentioned violence, intimidation and violence as a way of keeping political power, a monopoly of political power in the hands of Southern whites. This also generally was a method used to enforce white power, not just when it came to voting, but when it came to the racial hierarchy in general. And so, one of uh, the most sort of notable and horrifying examples of this was lynching. And lynching essentially means an execution carried out often by a mob outside the parameters of the justice system, essentially. Um, so this was something that again existed through this whole period um, post Reconstruction through the Civil Rights Movement, um, and it could be done for any number of reasons. Um, but one of the most common um, had to do when there or was occurred when there was either a suspected or actual sexual relationship between a black man and a white woman. And so this was something that seemed to be almost an obsession of those who wanted to maintain, again, not just the white power structure in the South, but this idea of racial purity and keeping races completely separate. And obviously, a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship between people of different races would be one of the most extreme, you know, violations of a separation between the races. Um, and so, usually, again, even if it was a consensual relationship, or even if it was not a relationship at all, but just a suspicion that there might be one, usually the accusations would take the form that a white woman had been raped by a black man. And rumors of this would go around, and ultimately, you would often have a mob abduct and then often torture and ultimately execute the man suspected of this. So, again, this was um, related. Individual lynchings were related to specific um, suspicions of something having happened. But we can also look at this in the broader sense of being the type of violence and the threat of the type of violence that would keep blacks in line in general, or would be aimed at doing that. That is to say, everyone knew that if you stepped out of the accepted bounds of behavior, violence was there as a potential means um, uh, to punish people, basically, for doing that. Now, of course, I've been talking mainly here about mob violence, but this also, could apply to violence from the state itself. That is to say, the police would also be a system or a method of keeping in place the white power structure, and police practices um, reinforced not just separation of the races, but sort of, again, the superiority of whites within the society. Um, so one of uh, the reading, the sources that you guys are reading for this first rotation of this unit, um, includes a number of sources related to one case I want to talk about for a second here, which is the case of Emmett Till. Um, so Emmett Till was a teenager, I think a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, who was visiting his extended family in Mississippi in 1955, and ultimately was lynched, not by a mob in this case, but murdered by two men. And the context for this was, well, the exact details aren't exactly clear. He had some sort of interaction with a white woman in a store. Um, Said something to her that was seen as violating the social norms of the time, interpreted maybe as flirting with her in some way. And a couple days later, that woman's, I think, a husband and brother basically went to the boy's grandfather's house where he was staying, abducted him, uh, you know, and then took him out into the forest and murdered him. His body was discovered a little while later. Uh, they had tied a cotton gin to him and thrown him into a river. So this became, uh, the trial of these two men became a national news story. Till's body had been extremely, they had beaten him extremely badly. So much, in fact, that at the defense, or at the trial, one of the defenses that was given was that it wasn't known even if this was Emmett Till, that his body had been mutilated so badly, and therefore there couldn't be a conviction if they couldn't know for certain that this was even Emmett Till, which was really an absurd defense. Um, but another consequence of this was that Emmett Till's mother decided to have an open casket funeral, um, to show the world, essentially, as I think she said, what they had done to her boy. Um, a a magazine, mainly aimed at an African American audience, then published a photo of his body and put it on the cover of that of one of their issues. So this really, again, brought the attention of the world, and especially of blacks in the United States, to this horrific action that had taken place, but again highlighting the nature of the type of violence that was really endemic in the society at the time. This case is often pointed to as maybe being one of the um, tipping points for getting the civil rights movement going. Ironically, again, I've mentioned that this type of violence and lynchings had been um, something that had, you know, maybe even by design, been meant to keep blacks in line. But at a certain point, there was so much outrage that enough people decided that they would begin to fight back in an organized way. Before we get into that, though, I do want to talk about um, life for blacks outside of the South, in the northern states and in the western states, for example. So, obviously, the majority of the black population in the U.S., the vast majority, up until the 20th century, was in the southern states. What you start to see, though, in the early 20th century is a population shift, something that becomes known as the Great Migration, as millions of blacks begin to move outside of the South. Now, one of the reasons for this, of course, was the system of discrimination and oppression that existed in the South. But you also had pull factors, if you will. If you think about, of course, the two world wars in particular, created a massive demand for labor in factories to meet the demands of those conflicts. And so, that was another thing that was driving the Great Migration. It's important to remember, even though we'll be focusing a lot on the South, that racism was by no means limited to the southern states. It existed throughout American society, and many blacks that moved to cities, whether they be in the Northeast, cities like New York, or the Midwest, cities like Chicago, Detroit, or out west to places like Los Angeles, is that they faced often just as much racism and discrimination as had existed in the southern states. Um, in terms of the social system, however, it was not as rigid in terms of laws, official restrictions written into the law. So what we often say is that in the South, there was something known as de jure segregation, segregation by law. Outside of the South, often instead what we see is what we would call de facto segregation. So even if there weren't laws in place that dictated that there were separate schools, separate facilities of any kind for blacks and whites, you often nevertheless saw segregation emerge. And so, for example, this would occur due to um, discrimination in housing, discrimination in employment, um, and so it would be much more difficult for blacks to get jobs in certain, often, higher paying occupations, and even blacks who maybe built up enough wealth uh, through their job would have difficulty, uh, buying houses or renting apartments, in most neighborhoods, and they would be restricted through various practices, um, from lending institutions like banks, um, or through the practices of real estate agents, or even just the practices of other homeowners in terms of who they would be willing to sell to. Um, and so there are all sorts of practices that were in place, um, that related to housing discrimination. So, for example, um, banks would have policies in place, even if they weren't sort of written down formally, that would make it more difficult for blacks to receive loans to buy a house. And real estate agents would kind of only show properties in certain neighborhoods. And there would be sort of an understood agreement among white homeowners to not sell to any prospective black buyers. Now, this is significant in a number of ways. What you see develop then are very segregated cities, often with black neighborhoods, black ghettos in the inner cities that received poor city services, um, and in which poverty and crime kind of became um, defining features, and it became difficult to kind of break out of that, even if your family, even if a family had started to make economic progress through their job, despite again the employment discrimination that was there as well. But another factor um, here is home ownership is for most people who do own a home, most middle class families, the main source of wealth that a family might have. That is to say, when you buy a house, it's not just a place to live, but it's in a sense an investment, right? In general, over time, home prices go up. So, when you later go to sell the house, you've built up equity and you've built up wealth. And so, if you have a situation in which blacks are basically systematically being denied the the ability to purchase a home, and so they're sort of only renting in many cases, that is cutting off a path to wealth accumulation, in addition to the effects that employment discrimination was already having. Okay, so I mentioned already in terms of this de facto segregation, poorer city services, uh, higher cases of police brutality, lack of economic opportunities within these segregated inner city ghettos. Okay, so that's the status quo that existed, in the early to mid 20th century for sure in the United States. In terms of the civil rights movement, the period we're going to mainly be focusing on is basically the decade from, well, the late 1950s and then the 1960s. But of course, this did not emerge out of nowhere. There certainly were foundations of this that had built up over many decades. And so, for example, some of the institutions within the black community of the United States that were important parts of this foundation included black churches, colleges, and labor unions that formed during the Jim Crow period. And a lot of the leaders of the future civil rights movement, you know, came from these movements. And obviously, we'll see, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. And many of the other leaders were ministers, had sort of gained their influence or built up their leadership skills and their organizational ties through the black church. Others, A. Philip Randolph, for example, was a labor union leader. And so, we have these institutions that are, segregated, but which still allow for, um, you know, leaders to emerge out of them. We also see, of course, the formation of civil rights organizations. One of the earliest examples of this was the NAACP, which was founded in 1909, and began campaigning against these various systems that we've been discussing. So against Jim Crow laws, against discrimination in voting, disenfranchisement, and against lynching. This image we see on this slide was a flag that the NAACP would fly at its New York headquarters, um, you know, anytime that there was a lynching that had occurred in the country. Um, and that became one of their big focuses during the early 20th century. Another thing to look at as kind of a foundation of the civil rights movement was the Harlem Renaissance. So this was a cultural movement during the 1920s, um, centered in the Harlem neighborhood of New York, which was a mainly black neighborhood. And what you see in the Harlem Renaissance is sort of this explosion of artistic activity in the black community there. Um, Everything from literary arts, poetry, novels. Langston Hughes, of course, being one of the major figures there, to the visual arts, to music, and certainly the emergence of jazz music um, as mainly a form coming out of the African American community, starting in the South, but spreading northward as well, and really becoming um, a major part of American culture as a whole, certainly by the 1920s. So this was significant not just in an artistic sense, but in a sense of helping to shape African American cultural identity and a sense of pride in the cultural accomplishments of blacks in the country, which is then kind of carried over into a driving factor in pushing for political rights as the civil rights movement gets going. Finally, in terms of origins, let's take a look here at the impact of World War II. First and foremost, you have just the contributions that blacks made to the war effort. Serving in the military, and we've talked a little bit about this when we were discussing World War II. We mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen, which was black fighter pilots who served with distinction during the war. But just black contributions in the military overall were quite significant. But then also their contributions on the home front in the war effort, to supporting the production of everything that was needed to fight that war. So these contributions basically became an argument in favor of expanding civil rights at home. The war itself, also, if you think about the nature of that war, we were fighting against, Nazi Germany, for example, which was defined by its racial policies in large part, which obviously resulted in genocide, but which were founded on an ideology of racial superiority, which was quite similar to the ideology that was basically propping up the racial hierarchy that existed in the United States and had been existing in the United States for decades. So I think that kind of cognitive dissonance maybe began to have its effects as well. So I mentioned A. Philip Randolph before, who had founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the first major black labor union in the U.S. He also became a crucial figure in lobbying the federal government, specifically first President Roosevelt and then President Truman, for taking executive action in areas where they had the authority to try to begin breaking down the system of segregation. Um, I mentioned the military before. Well, you know, during World War II, it was still a segregated military. And on the home front, even as blacks were making contributions, working in factories, you still had sort of discriminatory policies that were in place. And so, under pressure from Randolph and others, FDR did issue an executive order in 1941 that outlawed racial discrimination, specifically in defense industries, um, in industries that were producing materials for the war effort. And then after the war was over in 1948, again under pressure from Randolph and others, Truman issued an executive order that desegregated the military. Um, so this is really the first major institution in the United States that begins to integrate. This was around the same time, maybe the same year, maybe a year after Jackie Robinson becomes the first black baseball player to be admitted to play in the major leagues. And so you're starting to see some breakthroughs in other areas as well. But these are, these are things that are really forerunners to the bigger changes that will come later. The next big battleground for the civil rights movement, in terms of ending segregation, becomes schools, and this becomes the focus of the NAACP. Really as early as the 40s, but especially as we move into the 1950s, as you know, schools obviously are a huge government-run institution. That is to say, public schools are run by localities who and by states um, who have to follow, what's in the Constitution in terms of, for example, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which I mentioned before. And so the NAACP is pursuing a strategy of litigation, trying to go through the courts to essentially get rulings that will require institutions, and again, schools being their big target here, to desegregate. The case that ultimately makes it to the Supreme Court is, interestingly enough, in Kansas. Not a state from the Deep South, but still a state that had, state segregated schools. And so this was a case, Brown v. Board of Education, in which the Topeka School District was, their system of segregation was being challenged. The court rules in a landmark unanimous decision that this type of school segregation did indeed violate the 14th Amendment, and that therefore schools would have to begin to desegregate. Now, that was what became known as Brown 1, the first Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Education. Almost immediately, though, it became clear that this was going to be difficult to enforce. Even setting aside opposition to this ruling, obviously, the just the logistical process of integrating a school system, or obviously school systems throughout many states in the country, would be a difficult process to accomplish. But on top of that, of course, many states and localities opposed this ruling and were going to resist it as much as they could. So you had a second court decision, a second was known as Brown 2, a second Supreme Court case, a year later, which looked at this issue of enforcement or of implementation, I should say. Because the first case didn't really lay out, um, how quickly schools would have to do this. But Brown 2 didn't really do that either. Ultimately, the ruling said that states had to act with, quote, all deliberate speed. But this was vague enough that, as we'll see, the implementation was incredibly slow and often had to kind of be forced through, direct action and campaigns to bring attention to cases where it wasn't occurring. What the Brown decision, though, also does is it galvanizes the opposition to civil rights among whites who supported segregation. So you see the formation of what become known as white citizens' councils, basically groups of segregationists in the South that organize themselves to try to oppose what they see as the coming end to the Jim Crow system that they supported. So there's lots of various cases of crises that emerge over this issue, but we're going to look at one in particular. And the reading that you will be doing for next rotation looks at this as well. And this is the Little Rock crisis. So Little Rock, city in Arkansas, in 1957, begins the process or plans to begin the process of desegregating. And the NAACP is involved in this as well. Again, up until this point, even though it had been 3 years since the initial Brown decision, there basically had been no progress on integrating schools. And so they decided to try to force the issue. So 9 black students who were basically willing to go through with this and who were known to be, good students academically, to not have had problems with kind of their behavior in school growing up, basically were chosen to participate in this action of basically enrolling them in Little Rock Central High School, which had been the white high school in Little Rock. So the day that they're going to be enrolled in the school, you basically have first a mob of white protesters that come out to try to prevent them from entering the school, or to maybe even to attack them if they attempt to enter the school. Governor Faubus sends in the National Guard, ostensibly to maintain order, but really also to prevent the students from entering the school. Once that happens, this becomes really a federal crisis, and it becomes an issue that now President Eisenhower couldn't ignore. Because if you think about it, essentially the state of Arkansas is now, taking action that's directly in violation of what the Supreme Court has ruled. And so, as president, Eisenhower is in charge of enforcing the laws, of, for example, ensuring that Supreme Court decisions are followed. And so even though, he doesn't really want to get involved here, he knows that civil rights is a divisive issue, that racial issues are extremely charged politically. He feels he has no choice from kind of a constitutional perspective. So he sends in federal troops. He sends in I think, the 101st Airborne, and then ultimately also federalizes control of the Arkansas National Guard. And so now you have this situation flipped, where now the troops, as we can see in this photo, are actually escorting the students into the school. Um, Now that's day one, and this was obviously a major event. Photos and video of this was seen throughout the country, but that wasn't the end of it. You then had these students who had to basically go through the school year in a school in which many of the white students and I'm sure teachers and administrators as well didn't want them to be there. And so these students faced many cases of kind of harassment throughout the year. And because of these potential threats and chance for kind of disorder and maybe even violence to break out, troops actually remained at the high school throughout the entire year. And they kind of would be stationed and even in some cases maybe escorting students around, but certainly at least present in the school for the whole year. So a very kind of strange situation. These were all seniors, and all but one of them ended up graduating at the end of the year. There was one of this Little Rock Nine. One of the girls at one point had sort of been so fed up with being bullied by a number of the other students that in lunch one day she, I think, dumped her soup on top of another kid's head who was had been harassing her. And so the school ultimately, based on this and I think maybe another confrontation she had, ended up expelling her from the school. But again, for the most part, the other students were able to maintain their cool despite this hostile environment and graduated at the end of the year. But that's not the end of the story either, because the following school year, instead of allowing further integration to occur, Governor Faubus just closed the entire school district. That is to say, there was no school, there was no public school in Little Rock the next year, which obviously is an extreme action, and one that created a very chaotic type situation. One thing that he tried to do, so first of all, a number of certainly the wealthier white families started to send their children to private schools. Faubus at one point attempted to direct federal funds to subsidize other white students to be able to go to private schools. And the idea behind this is that private schools weren't bound by the Brown decision. Since the 14th Amendment relates to basically equal protection under the laws, meaning what's being provided by state institutions, public institutions. What courts did rule, though, in terms of what Faubus was doing here, was that he couldn't use public funds to subsidize students going to private schools. Anyway, this whole thing was so chaotic that ultimately schools did reopen the following year. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Virginia schools through the entire state were shut down for a whole year in what became known as massive resistance to the implementation of the Brown decision. Ultimately, across the South, including Little Rock, this process takes really over a decade. Because of this resistance, you don't really see school integration on much of a significant scale until well into the 1960s and then into the 70s. So it's just an example of how you can have a court ruling, but implementation is a whole nother question. Okay, we're going to end there as far as this lecture goes. In next class, we're going to pick up by looking at how desegregation occurred outside of the context of schools, how the sort of organized civil rights movement began to push for that to occur, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott. All right, so that's it for today, and I'll see you next time.